Welcome to Our Next Existence by Katie and the Chorus. I'm Katie, former technology strategist turned reluctant spiritual medium, and I channel messages from the Chorus, a group of beings just beyond our sensory perceptions who are loving, expansive, and who greatly enjoy sharing their perspective of us. Join us each week as we share and discuss their ideas about humanity's existence, purpose, and future. Concepts you can draw from to accelerate your path, expand your perceptions, and ultimately step into the flow of the universe and your life. Welcome back, everybody. So I would imagine there's a group of people who, when they saw this episode go out and get a notification, are probably really confused. Those people are my friends who about 1 week ago, right after the eclipse, I told them that I was stepping back from channeling. And yet here I am recording an episode. So something we should probably clarify right off the bat is that in this episode, it's going to be just Katie. And I will get to the explanation of what is happening and why, but if you were hoping to hear the chorus today, my apologies, you're stuck with me, the human. And for those friends who are like, what is happening? I don't actually know what I'm about to say as usual, but definitely not now that I'm here without any other beings to channel. But it felt like there was a lot for all of us to talk about. So let's start with what happened at the eclipse. Now, for any of you who are listening to this at a later point in time, based on what we would call it, based on our linear understanding of time, this might seem a little out of date. Because when I'm recording this, the eclipse has just happened a week ago. And for you, the eclipse may have happened a very long time ago by your perspective. But you see, something is now happening that probably many of us can feel, which is that all the time places that our civilization and society has affected are all starting to reconnect in really meaningful ways. And so you could string them all out on a line and say, I'm way down here in this time place, and you're way down there at the other end in your time place. Or, like the Federation describes in the end of the second book in their drawings, you could also look at time as a hub and a spoke type model. And so we are all existing in our present moment, and we are all potentially able to only see one of the spokes, one of the bubbles. Let's just call them grapes, okay? They're kind of like grapes all in a cluster. And so maybe up until now, you in your present moment and in my present moment, I had only been able to see one grape and you had only been able to see one grape. And now all the grapes in our bunch are starting to come together like a grape collision. And this grape collision, some might even call a thinning of the veil. Some might even call a shift in dimension. Some might even call a change in resonance. And absolutely every single one of those perspectives is accurate and true, infinitely for all time. But the question becomes, which one do you prefer? And for those of you who are listening right now in what you would construe to be my grape, my same portion of the cluster, and hearing me talk to someone in a different point of time as though they are right next door, might actually be bending your brain a little bit. And that's okay, because that is actually what's happening right now. For many of us who are reaching these frequencies already, we'll use a point in time reference. For those of us who are listening to this, no matter where you are in our concept of linear time, no matter how this resonance has found you, no matter how you believe you found it, we are starting to reach a resonance of reconnection, as the Chorus talks about often in their second book. This sense of timelessness, where we, in a way, supersede the definitions of a single day or a single month or a single year, is part of how we are reconnecting across different aspects of our reality, we might even say, that we would have construed as impossible to reach before. If you are 50 years in my future, according to the beliefs of this version of our time-place, I can't reach you unless I have a fancy machine or some technology or, I don't know, all sorts of understandings that I don't consciously have access to right now. But as my beliefs in time have softened, as I participate less in the aspects of limitation that they used to preach, as I am less affected by their rules of possibility, as we talked about in season 2, then the previously held barriers of time start to fade. And then I am able to perceive and interact with aspects of other time places. A few episodes ago, I told a story about something that happened to me in Chaco Canyon. One aspect of that whole experience that stood out to me for quite some time after was not only that I knelt down in just the right place to reach under this giant boulder and pull out this nearly intact bowl. What stood out to me was how soft the sand was. Now, as we all know, if a place is left over thousands and thousands of years, by our view today, that dirt will settle. It will harden. Over years, potentially hundreds to thousands of years of rain and erosion and settling and settling and settling, it develops sort of a different hardness, especially a desert-type floor, where perhaps there's lots of clay or things like that that harden the surface. But in this case, where I reached under the boulder could, theoretically, have been protected for thousands of years that the sand was still so fine and so soft and so dry. Or another way of looking at it is that I had reached a frequency where it had potentially just happened. Now, bear with me, because this is probably going to make even more sense as we keep going. But in the beginning, it might be like, what? So our initial question right at this crossroads would be, Katie, did you time travel to a different place? Well, as you know from listening to that story, I had 2 friends with me who were able to view me the entire time. So that kind of question would inherently include a follow-up question, which was, did all 3 of you travel to a different point in time? And that would be a very valid question and potentially a very valid perspective. However, as far as I know about them, and as far as I am clear on in my experience, I never got the sense that the environment that I was in changed, perhaps. I never got the sense that I, quote unquote, left Chaco Canyon of that time place. That time place I still firmly had a foot in, or a knee in, as I was kneeling on the ground. But also, I was able to reach into or start to reach into a different frequency, and out of that frequency or in that frequency connect to a manifestation that was translated into our 5 senses frequencies. The bowl was not entirely intact. The bowl did look like it had been weathered in some ways. And yet, the way I was able to connect with that artifact, you could construe as having been potentially closer to the time place in which that artifact arrived under that boulder that I connected to in my time place. It would be easy to understand why maybe we had thought we would close the distance of time travel by jumping. If our clusters of grapes, are very far apart from each other, I might have to jump from my grape into your grape. And that's a valid perspective, and not even one I know how to debate or comment on, because I have no conscious memory or concept of ever having done something like that myself. So the process I'm describing is very purely one of awakening and one of expansion, in which you don't leave a grape to go to another grape. You actually expand outward to encompass your grape and parts of another grape until eventually maybe all the grapes. So wouldn't it make sense that as you're expanding, there may be a period of acclimation or a period of expansion in which, as you are stretching into that other grape, your frequency, your energetic perception reaches it first before it is converted to or trickles down into some sort of five senses manifestation. So feeling the energy of a place, feeling potentially, as we would say, the emotion of a place, may be some aspect of you that is reaching into that other grape. And as you do that more and more and more, the trickle down effect or the manifestation of that energetic resonance would very naturally be translations of artifacts or scenery, potentially vistas, catching glimpses of, hearing sounds of aspects of this other grape. Most of the time, these things are still translated by the beliefs that we are expanding from, because those beliefs are expanding as we expand. The beliefs don't jump just like we don't jump. We're still coming out of this perspective. So being in Chaco Canyon, being in a belief system that I can't just time jump, being able to also feel the emotions of this ancient ones, this AO group, as we started calling them, I was able to in some ways perceive the aspects of their grape, but also I couldn't just bring through a totally intact, shiny bowl from their world into mine that wouldn't have translated with what I believed at the time. It would have been a violation of our belief systems. So instead, it came through in a way that we understand. It was a new connection between our grapes, at least from our perspectives. It was a new understanding of potentially more of what had gone on there from the perspective of their grape. But it also played nicely with or followed the rules of our grape. The gentleness of this process really shouldn't be undervalued. I think sometimes we want to jump grapes. Believe me, I've been there. I sometimes really want out of this grape. But also, it is sort of extraordinary and beautiful that your perspective is being honored at every step of your expansion. You can go to any ancient site that you're drawn to on this planet and trust and know and ease into the fact that your unique perspective will be honored and held as you expand into new and different ideas of what else that place has been or even is right now. Said another way, the distance shrinks because of the felt continuity of or the felt allowance for everything that you are in this grape and that one. So now we're going to connect this lovingly and gently to a related idea that the chorus has proposed. I believe they started bringing this up in season 1, actually in the very first few pages of the first book, which was, you have loved ones who have gone into the afterlife, and we understand your perspective that that is a very different place. But also, from our perspective, they're just in a slightly different frequency than you are. So much so that you could almost say that they believe a lot of the things that you believe. So sometimes in our podcast discussions, we've connected this to the idea that sometimes when we have a medium connect us to a loved one on the quote unquote other side, that loved one is still concerned about family members here. So there's still a belief potentially in protection or obligation. And those things we understand because we resonate with here. Even if that person is having a slightly different version of it, as we would say, maybe even a very different version of it, because they are on the other side and we're still down here living life, you could see how from the chorus's perspective, who doesn't hold any beliefs about protection at all, might consider us to be much closer together than potentially what we might say is the distance between us and the chorus. So now let's say one of our grapes in the bunch is a grape that we would call the afterlife. And I will also suggest that the afterlife might be actually many grapes that surround us. Okay, so let's connect this now to the topic of ghosts. Now, ghosts has been one of those mysteries of our kind for quite some time. We have ghost stories that go as far back as legends go back, as far back as oral history goes back, maybe even as far back as the creation of the experience of death goes back, frankly, as they talk about in book 2. Now, many people have many stories about seeing someone who has passed. And sometimes that person even appears very physical, very in the car with us or on the side of the road with us. And then later we find out through talking to someone at the local restaurant or somewhere else that that person did used to be in our grape, but is no longer. This would understandably cause some confusion because how could we construe someone who is no longer in our grape so physically? You might have a similar question about ghost experiences in which why does the person still appear to be wearing the clothing of that time period? I was listening to a podcast in the fall, in fact, and they talked about, wish I could remember his name, a guy who wrote one of the foundational books on spirits and poltergeists, and it may have been part of the spiritualist movement quite some time ago. And many of the stories took place in Europe, and one in particular was that this man's deceased mother would show up on the hillside near their house, and she was always wearing the clothes that she wore near the end of her life, which was a dress of that time period, and etc. So this is disturbing to us here because that would almost seem to reflect that they are stuck in a moment in time. So let's use the grape analogy then for the afterlife. So let's say we have a grape and it is the afterlife. And we'll just leave it at 1 for now, for simplicity's sake. And let's say that you are having one of this expand out of the grape moments. Well, then it becomes a lot like the artifact that I pulled out from under the boulder, in that you are able to perceive someone who is in a different grape. And also, there is likely to be a translation step. So if you understood that person from this grape, from that point in your belief systems here, which we might say from that point in the linear time aspect of your belief systems here, it would be understandable why your belief systems would translate that energy into something on the visible wavelengths of light that is the person, because you are seeing their energy, but would also append it to the last known place that you understood what they looked like in your grape. Because if you were to see them as they looked from the perspective of their grape, you might have a lot of questions about the afterlife. If they show up looking like they're from some starship or I don't even know what, you might be like, hang a sec. That looks a little different than the white toga I was imagining you in all of this time up in heaven. Or at least like a bathing suit or something. I don't know. Why are you wearing this? Would be a question. And maybe there are reasons and maybe there aren't. Maybe they're at a costume party. And then you would be like, I didn't know you had costume parties in heaven, right? So the questions would fire off immediately because you would be exposing yourself to a perspective that is more fully outside of your grape. This may also explain why some people, when they have had poltergeist experiences, see the person as they were when they were younger. I have several friends, actually, who have had experiences of seeing deceased loved ones, but when they show up, they're not exactly the way grandma or grandpa looked when they passed. They actually look like a younger version of themselves. This would be an even further reach potentially into their grape. You are allowing yourself to see that person in potentially more of their belief essence. And I say belief essence here, basically reaching outside of our beliefs of deterioration. Now, I don't have experience in a whole lot of other grapes that I'm consciously aware of, but I won't assume that deterioration works the same way in other grapes. Other grapes might have other healing technology. If another grape is from another point in time, maybe an Atlantean grape, maybe a Lemurian grape, Maybe they had sound technology and healing and all sorts of stuff. And so they don't look the same way we do as we progress in time in our grape. So let's say grandma or grandpa went to one of those grapes. Let's say they're over there in that grape having an experience that's kind of like protection here, but a little different, and they're living it up, and they're not aging like we do here. Maybe they're not as limited as we are here. Maybe we're the most limited grape of all. Not a title I was vying for, but I'm allowing for its possibility in the infinite universe. So again, you may be able to allow yourself the perspective of like, hang on, they look pretty great coming from their grape. This may be allowed because of beliefs you've adopted in our belief system complex, which maybe you believe that heaven is actually a pretty great place. And so it validates or resonates with some of your beliefs in seeing them young and healthy again. Or maybe you're just not even as constrained by beliefs about the afterlife at all. Maybe you've had a ton of weird experiences your whole life. Maybe you've had NDEs a bunch. Maybe you go into other grapes all the time. And so you have a lot of softened or loosened or opened beliefs about all these other places. And so in that way, you have again expanded beyond our grape and are allowing yourself to perceive more and different nuances of the other grapes. Okay, so I'm going to try to stop saying the grape word for a minute because it feels like I'm saying it a lot. But anyways, you get the point. So now that we've had like a 20-minute segue into what can happen as these time places start to converge, it would be important for me to touch upon something that the Course has alluded to quite often over the past couple years, which is that new energy, perceived from the perspective of our belief system, our grape, often senses like chaos. Now, in the beginning, I don't know, I guess I kind of assumed that this would be like a group chaos, like something would descend from the skies, or I don't know, stuff would blow up and it would be like, oh, I see it now. We all see it. We're in chaos. But as usual, awakening is an individual journey as well. And we all are going at a different pace, different curves, tracking different ways through this whole adventure. And so sometimes this sense of chaos can translate into a very personal and individual sense of chaos. Now, in the beginning, this took the shape for me of nonstop interruptions, as we've talked about in book 2. So I would want to get something done for the day, and then I would get sidelined. And I noticed that the frequency of those things was increasing. Well, we moved across country, and then that turned into like kind of a life interruption. And then I started to have even more life interruptions, as we've talked about. School went sideways, my relationship went sideways, etc. But then I also had a series of these trips, like I've described to Chaco Canyon, come up over the past year, which we will talk about. But the point being that leading up to this eclipse, my sense of true and total chaos had spread so far into all of my days that every single one of the mental projections, basically, that I had had for my life that I didn't even know I had made was each summarily dismantled. The last 3 months in particular, last 2.5 months in particular, were very challenging. Because I basically felt like from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep, everything was wrong. Mentally, I could not come up with a way to gratitude list, journal through, mantra through any of the stuff that was happening. Now, if you objectively came and looked at my life, you might be like, Katie, that doesn't make any sense. I'm looking at your life and I get it. You're going through a divorce and there's a lot of stuff, pain going on. But also, you have a roof over your head. You live in a beautiful state. Your child is healthy, right? There were so many things. And I recognized those things that at a previous stage in my life would have been enough to comfort me, or said another way, to console my mind. But these are not the things that I was feeling, because those were not the energies that I was in any longer. What happens when you expand so far outside of your grape that the mental function that runs our day-to-day lives here in this grape can't reach it? It doesn't compute. It cannot process. Basically, if you can think of the mind as being appended to this grape, or the thinking function as we have known it, and you reach all the way out deep into another grape where they don't think in the same way, and so you are resonant with their new and different version of thinking, as you draw your attention back into our grape and remember the things that you did over in that grape, our mind-based perspective here, when confronted with something that new and different, freaks the fuck out. To not put too fine a point on it, right? Think about any time you've come across something totally, bafflingly, and completely new. Even if you're lucky enough to even have those experiences. Let's say you're walking through the woods and a Bigfoot crosses your path, right? There is like a total mental freeze, even apart from a physical freeze sometimes. May only last an instant, may last several minutes, depending on where you're at and what you're working through. But in that instant of like free fall, the brain is actively trying to find an existent pattern or an existent concept to append that new experience to, in order to integrate it into the system of beliefs that we have here. Well, what happens if day after day, minute by minute by minute, you are exposed to not just Bigfoots, but creatures we don't even have names for, places that shouldn't be possible, aspects of our history that you shouldn't know, things that you can do that are inexplicable, events that you know you somehow took place in, but are not able to recall. Now, I know as I'm saying this, many of you are already starting to have this experience because we're all at the edge of our grape. No matter what point in time you are reaching these frequencies from, you are at the edge of a grape. Whatever time, place you call that. The good news is that because we're all expanding, what we're stepping into is a greater sense of wholeness, of completion, of self-knowingness and understanding. Not just about ourselves, but about everything else too. Everything else in this big old game, big old bunch of grapes game. But also, we are in the midst of a transition step. And so many of you may find that it is getting challenging, or potentially even has been challenging for a while, to think about your life, to think about this onslaught of memories that you're having, or to even mentally process or feel okay with some of the experiences that seem to just keep coming at you. And that is a valid perspective, that they are coming at you, that they are coming through to you. But another way to look at this direction is that they're happening so rapidly because you are expanding outward, and not just in one direction, but in multiple directions at once. In the beginning, it can be pretty confusing which aspect of which thing you're starting to understand about yourself is coming from which grape. You don't even have names yet for any of this stuff. I mean, there's nothing even you can understand about it. And in the beginning, we might try and say like, oh, that must be Atlantis, and that must be Egypt, and that must be a Native American life that I had. But eventually, the concepts that we built in our grape run out of runway. And you experience, as you expand, this shift, this unknownness, which can sometimes feel like a total free fall and can other times feel like total ignition. And it is because it is both, depending on the expanded aspect of yourself that you're resonant in, or if you're coming back into a mental aspect of yourself that's still resonant here. So safe to say, as I went through this year, which, thanks for your grace and just assuming it is as chaotic as I was describing. I know we haven't gotten to hardly any of the stories yet, but we will, and they'll show up in their right times. But safe to say, I had this onslaught, or said another way, I expanded into multiple grapes at once. So in the last 2 months leading up to the eclipse was very difficult. I found daily life practically impossible to slog through from my mental perspective. From the time I woke up in the morning, I was sure it was all a disaster. That felt sense of total and complete disaster. There is nothing we can do to recover from this. It is absolutely lost. That is the exact sensation that my mind woke up with and that my mind carried often throughout the entire day. Sometimes it would soften by the afternoon once I had done enough physical things in our environment that it was somewhat appeased. Like, oh, you got up. Oh, you went to the grocery store. Oh, you said hi to that person. It sort of was like a soothing through the doing. And that did help, but also there was no amount of doing that would ever appease it completely, which I discovered. And by the evening, as I got ready to go to sleep again, this total sense of complete and utter disaster would return to me. And that is because often I would expand into another grape every time I went to sleep. And my conscious perspective in this life was becoming more and more aware of that, and also more and more conscious of all the things that were happening in the other grapes every night when I went to sleep. There was nowhere to hang it all up. I didn't have enough room in this closet, in this 5 senses thinking closet. I didn't have space for all these other lives I had been apparently living or existing in. There was just no way to order it all or name it all or think about it all. It was just too big. There were too many pieces, and I definitely hadn't spent enough time with them yet to even understand them. So the daily slog continued, and I will say I have had some of the most intense experiences of my life in the last 2.5 months, but I have a feeling they aren't the most intense. This expansion is expanding the way expansion does. But, also I think as I continue, I will be able to expand with it and understand more about it. So I don't know, your first step outside the door into the hurricane often feels the most windy because you haven't realized yet that you can control the wind and the sky and the water, and you have your own skill set, right? So many of us are at the holy crap, it's really windy out here step. And when we return into a mental perspective to try and cognate that or integrate that, that's when we start to feel this end of the road type of sensation, this total chaos, felt embodied resonance. So the chorus was with me through all of this. And sometimes I would wake up in the morning, and I would be like, I don't even know how to do this. And, sometimes they were there and they would say, open your eyes. They would coach me through each next step until finally, I had brushed my teeth and I had eaten breakfast and my brain just couldn't admit that it was a total disaster because actually what I made for breakfast was pretty good. But the sky was about to fall any freaking second. And the chorus was there. But something that I noticed as I went through these last couple months is that I had run out of questions. Questions were the heart and soul of our relationship through all of those years. It was like I opened a door, I said, come on in, and they took a seat next to me, and I kept going through daily life. And as I did so, I would be like, what do you think about this? What about this one? What about that? Why do we do that? It was the journey. It was what we did together. And yes, there were many times that they reassured me or said, well, how about we explain our version of this concept? And I'd be like, sure. I didn't have any totally pressing questions in that moment. But looking back now, I realized the basis of our connection from those wavelengths was one of a mental questioning. And so as I came through this tail end of this year of being completely out of runway for thinking, of expanding into these other grapes, of coming back and back again to like a feeling of total broken, irrecoverable chaos. In the final steps of this process, I couldn't get over the fact that it felt like it was the end. And I looked everywhere for evidence. Sometimes I thought it was the end of the world. And in the later weeks, I thought it was potentially the end of me. And it's a very strange experience to connect fully and consciously to beings from another dimension and accept that one possibility may be that I would die. This is how it felt. I mean, that was the resonance. And the chorus, as usual, was so soothing and so loving. And they pointed out that, well, when you start to reach into these other frequencies so fully, when you have run out of runway for the mind to reach that far outside of its belief system, the only belief it has left to draw upon is that it is the end. It is in some ways the end from that perspective, but it is not the end and perhaps even the beginning from many other perspectives. I found this very comforting. And also, with the chorus, I still acknowledge that I may still actually die. They had a very nice way of saying it, but maybe I would just die in a different way or exit these frequencies in a different way because I didn't know how else to reconcile this sense of non-stop ending. So the final days leading up to the eclipse were, as you might imagine, the most difficult to get through. And I actually had a really pretty awesome last 4 weeks leading up to the eclipse. I had friends come in from out of town, out of nowhere. They made all these plans. They rented a boat to go on a dolphin cruise. I mean, all I had to do was say yes and show up, and it was magic. And even when I would write that down and be like, okay, brain, look, we had a lovely day today, it still wasn't enough to soothe it. Because while I was on that boat, you bet I was sensing all sorts of energy. And while I was walking with my friends on the beach, I could feel all the things that they were feeling. And so as much as I was in our grape, I was definitely still resonant with frequencies of other possibilities beyond our grape. It just kind of happens as we all expand. So the brain was not satisfied by my amazing last 4 weeks. And as the eclipse came, I couldn't help but feel like this end that I was sensing was going to be appended to it in some way. So I was a little worried about life and friends and, I don't know, the world. And frankly, mainstream media did not help with that. All kinds of media didn't. And I ended up staying home, and my son ended up having a stomach ache. And so we just kind of hung out together for the eclipse. It was really kind of cool. But after the eclipse completed, so it reaches its zenith, it reaches totality. And I'm not even in the path of totality, right? I'm watching it online and watching my 60% in Florida. So after it reaches its totality and goes out the other side, I break down in tears, basically. I mean, it wasn't pretty. It was a total ugly cry of the over sensation. And it lasted for hours and I couldn't shake it. And my poor kiddo was kind of like worried about me. And I was like, it's okay. Emotions are there for a reason. I don't know. Let's just watch, a movie night together. We'll be fine. And I grieved that night in a way that I haven't ever grieved before because I had no concept of what I was grieving. Couldn't even guess. I was out of runway. And then when I finally collected myself the next day, I realized what it was. I don't think in the same way that I used to. I resonate here differently, which means all that connection that I had with the chorus through those frequencies had now changed. Or said another way, was different. At first, I didn't know if I would still be able to connect to the chorus at all. There was a 24-hour lull after the eclipse where it just wasn't clear to me. And then the next day in the morning, they showed back up again. But they showed up again in a different way. How can I describe this? So usually when I channel, all these years prior, I would be thinking. That's what we do here. Our minds kind of go nonstop. And I would patch into them from that thinking place. So thinking about what I was going to do, wondering about this as I made it, wondered what they thought about it, and I would pick up the phone line. And there they would be, loving as ever. But I just wasn't in that thinking state anymore. I mean, it was still a part of me. It still is. Kind of churns in the background because I still have my foot in that grape. But there's just this sense of other things too, these non-thinking parts of me. So about a day later, the chorus showed up in a different part of me. It's the best I can describe it. They've moved in my body somehow. I mean, they kind of just wrap you in a bear hug and send you all this waves of love. So it's kind of always all over in some perspectives. But in another perspective, they're in my resonance now. Like I feel them into my body in a different way. It circumvents any thinking altogether, where I understand what they mean without even having to validate it for myself by thinking about it afterwards. And so just like they had done for many times in the weeks leading up to the end, they had often asked me, but do you still feel us? And I'd be like, yeah, okay, it's the end of the world, but I still feel you. Okay, I get it. I guess that's good, but I don't like this. I was grouchy, going through a transition. But once the eclipse had passed and all I could do was feel them, I realized why they had asked me that question so many times in the final weeks. So, is the chorus here today? Yes. Absolutely. Infinitely. Can I mentally process what they're saying right now and then spit it out through our squeaks and whistles? I can't. I don't know what this means. I didn't know what it meant. And so in the first days after the eclipse, I sort of packed up my office. In some ways, it still feels like that era of Katie and the chorus is over. I'm not the person that I was when I first made that first episode, when I first wrote down their first sketches. And yet, I'm still here. And they're still here. Maybe I switched grapes and didn't know it. Maybe you did too. Or maybe we're just expanding into something new and different. that finally truly reaches beyond all the grapes in this amazing game. And I still love and appreciate those thinking experiences with the chorus that I had. And also, there's part of me that's grateful that I could come here and share with you all the truth about how it's changed. I think in some ways, it is an ending. And also, I know in my heart that it is a beginning. So if you feel like the end is near, and whatever grape you are listening to this episode from, it may be that something drastic is about to happen in your grape. From the five senses perspective, that was a reality that we successfully created. And I'm pretty sure that that reality expanded or was experienced through many different grapes. And also, maybe that sense of ending is the walls of all of these grapes tumbling down as you and I and many others start to expand into memories, reconnections, stumbling into ancient places that were once there and are coming back again, into so many ways that we are rediscovering all the aspects of, all the fractures within this incredible existence. And while yes, it may mean that the way you experience your grape is changing, it also means that the field of play is about to get a whole lot bigger. And guess what? Turns out, the chorus is with us there too. We love you infinitely. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you found these messages to be helpful. May they accelerate you on your path wherever you'd like it to go. For more information on the books which correspond to these podcast seasons, our podcast, live events, or how to get in touch with us, visit katieandthechorus.com. Thanks again. See you next time.